Some silences are heavier than others. Not the comforting quiet of a sleeping home, nor the vast hush of a desolate wilderness. I'm talking about the kind of silence that feels stuffed, packed with unspoken words, suffocated screens, and a pervasive, chilling stillness that wraps around you like a shroud. These aren't just empty spaces, they are cursed states. Pockets of the world where sound itself has been devoured, replaced by an echoing void that craves the very essence of human expression. We often imagine curses as a visible blight, a physical ruin. But the most insidious ones, they are beautiful. They gleam. They lure you in with a deceptive allure, only to reveal their true horror once you're trapped within their shimmering confines. And nowhere has mastered this more intimately than the architectural marvel, the tragic legend, the utterly silent structure known in hushed tones as the Glass House. The Glass House, a monument to modernism, built in the mid-20th century by an avant-garde architect, Elias Vance. It was meant to be a living work of art. Walls of glass, minimalist design, blurring the lines between inside and out, nature and structure. A sanctuary of light and clarity. But from its very inception, the Glass House was steeped in whispers. Whispers not of admiring critics, but of unsettling serenity of guests who left feeling oddly detached, and of a pervasive quietness that clung to the property, even on the windiest days. The official records speak of a visionary architectural triumph, celebrated for its unique aesthetic and profound sense of peace. They cite glowing reviews, but gloss over the alarming number of individuals who spent extended periods within its transparent walls and either ceased to create, or more chillingly, lost the ability to communicate. Their voices fading into a perpetual murmur, their expressions blank. Just the inevitable consequence of extreme artistic isolation, perhaps a touch of creative burnout magnified by unconventional living arrangements the art critics might have. Concluded compounded by a stubborn refusal to install proper curtains, or God forbid, a sensible brick wall. You know, high-minded idealists just a bit too committed to the transparent aesthetic. A perfectly intellectual, utterly terrifying dismissal of a profound, unnatural absorption. But the pervasive silence of the Glass House wasn't a testament to peaceful meditation. It was a bargain. A very old, very dark pact forged between its ambitious architect and something ancient that dwelled beneath the very bedrock of the property. Something that demanded not sacrifice, but sound. And the sound it truly craved wasn't music or laughter. It was the rich, nuanced symphony of human communication, the vibrant resonance of expression, the very voice of individuality. They were cultivated. Their vocal cords ripened, and then in a chilling cyclical ritual, their expressions were harvested. They say that on the clearest nights, when the stars are sharp as shattered glass, you can still hear it. A faint, almost imperceptible hum rising from the transparent walls. The sound of a perpetual hunger patiently waiting for its next season's bounty of speech. Our story centers on Dr. Cassie Bell, a cognitive linguist specializing in speech pathology and the psychology of communication. Cassie wasn't interested in traditional hauntings. She was fascinated by the subtle, pervasive influences that could reshape human language and expression. Her work involved analyzing old audio recordings, deciphering unusual vocal patterns, and unearthing the suppressed phonetic narratives of individuals gripped by inexplicable speech impediments. And for Cassie, the inexplicable patterns of widespread muteness or aphasia in seemingly healthy people were always the most intriguing. Cassie stumbled upon the Glass House while researching a historical anomaly. Consistent abnormally high rates of unexplained vocal cord paralysis and aphasia documented in the region surrounding the Vance estate even during periods of robust public health. The records were sparse, often buried in obscure medical journals and local historical society notes, but they all pointed to the glass house as a peculiar speech anomaly hotspot. There were also vague, unsettling mentions of the quietening, the soundless sickness, and the house's embrace terms that defied standard medical definitions. Further research into old local interviews and personal letters yielded tantalizing fragmented clues. Vague mentions of individuals becoming terribly calm, of their voices growing thin and reedy, and of a collective tendency for residents to avoid speaking above a whisper, particularly after visiting the Vance estate. These records were often heavily redacted or dismissed as quaint provincial superstitions by later medical boards. But Cassie, with her knack for hearing the nuances behind the clinical language, saw a chilling narrative emerging. A property that wasn't just influencing its occupants, but consuming their very voices before leaving them as silent, placid shells. The peculiar, almost unnerving serenity of the current glass house, often remarked upon by architectural historians, also caught her attention. They'd praise its tranquility, but Cassie found it too quiet. It was the same unsettling peace described in the ancient whispers about the original property's effect on its inhabitants. This wasn't just a historical mystery. It was a linguistic enigma, a psychological anomaly, and a personal challenge for Cassie. "Right," she muttered to her perpetually chattering pet parrot Echo, who mimicked her words with unnerving accuracy. Either this house has perfected some groundbreaking form of silent therapy, or I'm about to become intimately familiar with the definition of vocal cord erasure. Probably both, knowing my luck. For a woman whose life ambition involves analyzing the precise intonations of ancient dialects, I really do stumble into the strangest, most existentially inconvenient situations. Echo just squawked clearly, unimpressed by the impending supernatural. Case study. The drive to the glass house was surprisingly inviting at first. A long, winding private road through manicured gardens and perfectly still ponds. But as Cassie approached the property, a subtle change occurred. The air grew strangely. Still, the distant sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds fading into an almost oppressive quiet. The house itself, a shimmering cube of glass and steel against the autumn sky, had an unnerving stillness to its transparent walls, reflecting only the endless blue. There were no sounds emanating from within, no faint hum of electricity, no creaking of structure. The entire building felt strangely muted, almost dead, despite its apparent vibrancy. She unlocked the heavy, almost soundless pivot door, accessing the property through permission from the Vance estate. The interior was vast, flooded with light and immaculately clean. But the silence inside was profound. Not the quiet of an empty building, but a heavy, almost expectant stillness. Even her own footsteps, usually crisp on concrete, seemed muffled, absorbed. Her first few days were spent deploying high-sensitivity microphones, setting up time-lapse cameras, and preparing her advanced sound spectrum analysis equipment. She took meticulous notes on the ambient acoustics, air pressure, and structural vibrations. Everything pointed to a miraculously sound-dampened, yet unnervingly static environment. As she began her initial passes with her soundwave imager, she immediately detected anomalies within the glass walls. There were strange, non-natural energy signatures, almost like a faint rhythmic pulse emanating from directly within the glass panels themselves. The pulse she detected from satellite data became stronger, almost palpable, resonating through the air and eerily through her very eardrums. And then she saw it on the imager's monitor. Not structural flaws, but vast interlocking patterns of extreme sound absorption, like an impossibly complex acoustic network, far larger and more efficient than any human design. It spanned entire walls, radiating from the very core of the house. And from within its depths, the strongest energy signatures emanated. It was like a colossal silent ear, listening beneath the very structure of the house. As she moved her equipment closer, the image seemed to shift. A faint tremor passed through the glass, and then a subtle, almost imperceptible phenomenon registered on her sensitive acoustic sensors. A low, resonant hum. Not a structural vibration, but a deep, pervasive oscillation that seemed to fill the entire audible spectrum, yet produced no discernible sound in the air. Cassie felt a prickle of unease. This wasn't just soundproofing. This was something else. The clear, cold glass, the oppressive silence, the strange hum, it all began to coalesce into a profound sense of wrongness. She dismissed it as faulty sensors, as artifacts of the extreme acoustics. Right, she mumbled, sipping lukewarm coffee. Either my cutting-edge $1 million equipment is suddenly experiencing a dramatic nervous breakdown, or this house is actively trying to communicate. And honestly, for a minimalist architectural masterpiece, it's being remarkably passive-aggressive. If you want to talk glass house, just say something, don't give my sound imager a panic attack. She tried to keep her voice steady, but a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Over the next few days, Cassie meticulously documented the acoustic anomalies. The deeper she probed, the more pronounced the strange pulsating energy became. The hum intensified, becoming a constant low thrum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. And the patterns from the soundwave imager grew more unsettling. She discovered that the acoustic network was far more complex than mere sound absorption. It seemed to expand and contract, almost breathing, and radiated a faint internal glow, a low malevolent pulsation that registered only on her most sensitive optical sensors, indicating a profound psychoacoustic energy. It was like a colossal silent brain dreaming within the very structure of the house. More disturbing were the echoes she began to pick up on her advanced audio recorders and sometimes on the high-resolution cameras embedded in her automated probes. Not physical distortions, but faint shifting spectral patterns, translucent shapes that seemed to drift through the walls, indistinct humanoid forms that would appear for a moment, then vanish. They weren't light refractions. They were something else. She also started to feel a peculiar hunger. Not for food, but for sound. An insatiable craving to send her probes deeper, to push the limits of her research, to understand the source of the hum, the nature of the echoes. She'd spend hours losing track of time, only emerging from the glass house, blinking into the oppressive twilight, feeling drained yet oddly compelled. The hunger was a dull ache at first, then intensified, making her feel lighter, less substantial, and oddly more attuned to the subtle shifts in the house's eerie stillness. She tried to dismiss it as academic obsession, a common affliction among dedicated researchers. Just the usual brain rot from too much soundwave analysis, and not enough human conversation, she'd mutter, forcing down another bland protein bar. Probably also explains why I'm starting to think the giant glass brain is trying to send me silent operas. Or perhaps just politely requesting a new batch of vocal cords. You know, for a sentient architectural organism, it's being remarkably subtle about its communication needs. Her dry humor was becoming a desperate internal monologue, Her only companion, the ceaseless hum of the house. One evening, reviewing archived architectural blueprints and personal letters from Elias Vance, she stumbled upon unsettling details. His correspondence grew increasingly fixated on perfect resonance, on absorbing all dissonance, and on the ultimate silence. His later letters were fragmented, filled with odd gaps. He spoke of a prior phenomenon, the Great Quiet, where the initial occupants of the land had become withdrawn, their voices blank. The house's embrace, he called it. He described how individuals would eventually simply disappear, leaving no audible trace. One old construction worker in a faded interview, his voice a reedy whisper, muttered, "It wasn't just the walls that quieted them. It was the hunger." The hunger was already eating their words from within. Clara felt a cold dread. The hum, the echoes, the fading voices. It all aligned. This wasn't just a house. It was a place that had already begun to consume its inhabitants. Expressions long before modern records were kept. And the architecture was not just design. It was a chilling metaphor for the entity itself. She knew what she had to do. She had to understand the core of the perpetual harvest. The next phase of her research was different. Cassie decided to use a specialized acoustic probe, one designed for navigating complex resonant frequencies. She had to experience it with her own senses. The hunger for answers was a burning compulsion, overriding all caution. As the probe descended into the profound silence beneath the glass house, the hum intensified, vibrating through its very structure, resonating in Cassie's own chest through the haptic feedback controls. The view outside the probe's cameras was thick with compacted soil, but as it neared the center of the energy signatures, a strange ethereal light began to emanate from the depths below. And then it appeared on the probe screen. Not a single object, but a vast organic network of thick pulsing tendrils, interwoven like an impossibly complex neural system, but clearly biological, radiating that soft internal glow. It was vast, ancient, and seemed to pulse with a silent, living energy. It was the true heart of the glass house. As the probe approached, the whispers began. Not sounds in the air, but voices in her mind. Faint at first, then growing louder, emanating from the network itself. Hear, empty, become, still. They were insidious, tempting whispers, promising ultimate understanding of communication, of tranquility, of the very nature of silent existence. It was the ultimate lure for a cognitive linguist obsessed with the human voice. But Cassie felt the terrifying truth behind the promise. It was the erasure of the individual mind, the absorption into a collective primordial consciousness. She thought of the old construction workers' words. The hunger was already eating their words from within. This wasn't a house that merely contained sounds. It was a house that consumed sounds by absorbing everything that vibrated within it. The probe's internal systems began to flicker, its camera feed glitching. The hum was deafening in her mind, threatening to drown out her own thoughts. She felt herself being drawn closer, an irresistible pull, not physically but mentally. Her hands instinctively reached for the controls, but her limbs felt heavy, her movements sluggish. Then she saw it. In the reflective surface of the probe's own camera lens, her own reflection. But it wasn't quite right. Her eyes were too wide, too dark. Her mouth open in a slight, unnatural smile. And within the lens, a faint, translucent figure, indistinct, composed of swirling dust and shadowy forms. It had no discernible face, but its form was vaguely humanoid, its limbs seeming to extend into the very depths of the earth. It was the fames, the entity of consumption, the hunger that had taken the glass house. The reflected Cassie slowly reached out a hand, mirroring her own, but its touch was cold, absorbing. She recoiled, staring at the terrifying image. This wasn't a haunting. It was emerging. A consumption. A house was the heart of the entity, drawing everything into its silent, hungry being. Well, this is rather inconvenient, Cassie thought, a desperate, almost manic chuckle rising in her throat. Just when I thought I was having a dull day of acoustic analysis, turns out my reflection is trying to absorb my entire being into a giant sound-absorbing network. Very dramatic. You'd think after all this time, a sentient subterranean acoustic entity would at least learn some manners, or invest in better facial recognition. This one makes my nose look huge, and I'm about to be erased. Priorities, people. Her dark humor was a desperate, almost suicidal defiance against the creeping nothingness. Cassie forced herself to remember the fragmented records, the whispers of the original inhabitants of the land, the great quiet, the loss of self. This curse wasn't about violence. It was about forgetting how to speak, about being silenced. And the ultimate price was to become part of the collective amnesia, a silent echo in the Earth's unending hum. She understood now. The network wasn't just an acoustic system. It was the central node of the fame's entity within the glasshouse. It consumed memories, identities, and consciousness, specifically targeting the ability to express, to communicate. And in doing so, it grew stronger, perpetuating its own existence. By slowly integrating the very essence of human expression into its boundless living consciousness. The whispers promised ultimate understanding of silent harmony, the perfect assimilation of all that was, but the price was the very self. She had to fight it not with force, but with voice. Her own voice. Her personal expression. The specific, unique nuances that made her Cassie Bell. She pulled herself back from the drone controls, her limbs heavy. She fumbled for her sealed emergency kit, pulling out a small, worn audio recorder, a device filled with her own voice notes, her academic lectures, even recordings of Echo's silly squawks. It was a simple personal memory, utterly devoid of grand theories. It was just a moment of pure, unadulterated expression and self-definition. She focused on that recorder, on the sound of her own voice, on Echo's familiar mimicry. She concentrated on the feeling of sound vibrating in her throat, the very act of articulation. These were small, seemingly insignificant details, utterly personal, utterly hers. They were not universal knowledge. They were the anchors of her individual existence. The network pulsed violently. The whispers in her mind intensified, turning into a cacophony of distorted voices, all screaming, forget, release, surrender. The probe shook, its connection flickering. She slammed the audio recorder against the drone's control screen, pressing it directly against the point where her distorted reflection and the shadowy entity had appeared. A blinding flash of static erupted from the screen, followed by a deafening shriek that resonated through the tent. The underground network pulsed erratically, its internal glow flickering like a dying flame. The spectral figure of the fames recoiled from the screen, dissolving into fragments of swirling dust and shimmering light. The overwhelming hum ceased. The pervasive cold dissipated, replaced by the normal chilling temperature of the night air. The drone's connection stabilized, the screen clearing. Cassie collapsed against the controls, gasping for breath, her entire body aching. She was alive. She was herself. But the glass house had shown her a horrifying truth. This wasn't just a local legend. It was a fundamental force of erasure. It shifted. It adapted. It consumed. And it would keep consuming quietly, relentlessly. While she gasped, her voice hoarse, a sliver of her old humor returning through the shock. That was a rather aggressive attempt at a vocal extraction. Definitely going to need therapy after this. And maybe a very long, very strong coffee. Or perhaps just a quiet existential crisis in a very, very loud space. Far away from any silent structures. Definitely no glass. Sorry, echo. She gathered her equipment, packed her car, and drove away from the glass house. The journey out felt strangely muted. The house, once vibrant, now seemed unnaturally still. She saw no more visual echoes. The spectral figures were gone. The direct threat had receded. She reached the paved road, then the highway, and finally civilization. She stopped at the first bustling diner she saw, pulling into the parking lot with a shuddering sigh. She felt an urge to talk, to explain, to scream her horrifying story. But as she looked at the other patrons, their faces bright, their laughter easy, she knew she couldn't. How could she explain a place that consumed voices and expression when her own voice still felt a little hoarse, her expressions a little muted? She ordered coffee. When the waitress asked for her name, she hesitated for a long moment. She had to consciously search for it, pull it from a distant, almost forgotten corner of her mind. Cassie, she finally managed the name, feeling foreign. Cassie Bell. She knew it was her name. She knew who she was intellectually. But the feeling, the sense of being Cassie Bell, the passion, the quirks, the unique perspective, it was all muted. Like a recording that had been played too many times, its clarity faded, its nuances blurred. She returned to her modest home. Echoer. Parrot chattered excitedly, mimicking her previous words. Cassie petted him mechanically. She felt a quiet companionship, a theoretical understanding of affection. But the spontaneous warmth she usually felt was dampened. She was observing the emotion rather than fully experiencing it. She looked at her research, her meticulously organized archives. She knew what they were. She knew their linguistic significance. But the intense passion, the all-consuming obsession that had defined her life was gone. It had been part of the flavor she had deliberately shed. She was a blank canvas. She was present. She was Cassie Bell. But she was a greatly reduced version. The entity hadn't fully consumed her, but it had taken a very large bite. She was a survivor, yes, but one who had paid a steep existential price. She tried to go back to her research, but the arcane texts felt less compelling. The thrill of discovery, once so potent, was now a mere intellectual exercise. She completed her report on the glass house, a dry, factual account of its historical speech anomalies and alleged disappearances, carefully omitting any mention of pulsing underground networks, hungry entities, or the deliberate unraveling of her own soul. She couldn't. The words for it felt too grand, too vibrant for the muted person she had become. She sent the report. It was well received, lauded for its meticulous research. She got an offer for a new prestigious research position. She accepted. She would continue her work, but it would be work performed by a ghost of her former self. She continued to live, to function. She ate, she slept. She paid her bills. She took care of Echo, but the hunger remained a faint phantom ache in her gut, a subtle echo of the entity that had almost consumed her. It was a reminder that parts of her were still missing, parts that might never return. And sometimes late. At night, when the world was silent and the memory of the humming house returned, she would catch her reflection in a dark window. And for a fleeting second, she would see something else. A flicker of something utterly blank, a void where her eyes should be a ghost of the fame's hunger looking out. It was quickly gone, replaced by her own muted reflection. But she knew it was there, a lingering echo, a silent testament to the price of survival in a truly cursed state. Because some curses, dear listener, don't just kill you. They hollow you out. They make you a part of their unending hunger. And they wait, patiently, for the next uncurious soul to stumble into their forgotten feast. And in a cursed state like the glass house, where the very voice is the bait, and curiosity, the ultimate trap, the greatest horror, isn't being haunted. It's realizing that you've just become part of the very story you are trying to understand, and that the next whispered word might be your own fading echo